Don't worry.
From now on, everything can be used against us. Wir hatten uns sogar nicht das Gespräch. Ja, ich habe auch gelassen.
Ja, ich habe auch ein bisschen bei der Diskussion.
So, können Sie mich verstehen? Also ich höre noch nichts, weil Sie auf jeden Fall auf Stumm sind. Wunderbar, danke.
as well, we all know this is not just quite an effort because of the pandemic, but especially or additionally also because the Deutsche Bahn has announced to be on strike tomorrow. So Wolfram Kaiser's way back is hopefully working, but still we need a little bit of luck. So thank you very much that you're coming. This is we're just happy to have you. Wolfram Kaiser is giving a lecture within our first workshop. Some of our colleagues from the Hamburger Institute of Social Research are with us on Zoom. The workshop has taken place throughout the day on the title Deconstructing Europe, Euroscepticism in European Integration History. To everyone who has not been with us today, I can assure you that it's great to have discussions in person. And actually this, and Wolfram Knöbel and I told you when just a few minutes ago that this is actually the first time we're having someone at the Institute giving an evening lecture with an audience. So thanks again that you're here. Wolfram Kaiser is Professor of European Studies at the University of Portsmouth. He's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. But when he started out his academic career, that was right here in Hamburg. So in a certain way, you're coming home. Wolfram Kaiser has published more articles and books that are relevant for our subject that I could possibly specify or mention. And I won't try. It's just one of the reasons why I'm especially happy that you've managed to arrange to be with us tonight is that we couldn't possibly think of a scholar who has more experience on various subjects that touch directly on many of our individual questions. And let me just mention a few things you have done besides many articles in the Journal of European Integration History, Contemporary European History, European Review of History. We have read in our reading group, and I told you about this, a special issue that you just published in the Contemporary European, in the Journal of Contemporary European Studies in May 2021. Just to give you an impression of the books Wolfram Kaiser has published in 1999, Using Europe, Abusing the Europeans, Britain and European Integration, 1945 to 1963. In 2007, Cambridge University Press, Christian Democracy and the Origins of a European Union, which I think has set new standards regarding that subject. And not that long ago, co-authored with Johann Schultz, Writing the Rules for Europe, Experts, Cartels, and International Organizations Making Europe Power. So we are happy to have you. We are quite excited that you made it, and we are eager to know what you want to tell us. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. But first of all, I would like to tell you that it would be nice if I could get some water.
Yes.
And then secondly, thank you very much for your very kind invitation here to this institute. As I said, I didn't actually start out my studies at the University of Hamburg, but I actually did my PhD here, although I hardly spent any time here. I was always at the University of Edinburgh during this period. Thank you. But my PhD is indeed from the University of Hamburg, and I found out earlier today, because the hotel is very close to the campus, of course, that nothing very much seems to have changed here, at least in terms of the buildings. They look very similar to the time when I was here, which is now quite a few years ago, as you could probably figure out from listening to the list of my publications, which was in the 1990s. Now, I'm really happy to be here for a number of reasons, not just because I'm coming back, as you put it, to Hamburg, but also because I think your project is a very exciting one on Euroscepticism, and I understand that you're already aware of the dangers of using this particular term, but it was perhaps necessary to use it for the purposes of the funding bit, and you're already problematizing it. I find the project particularly interesting because it also takes a comparative and transnational approach and broad European approach to trying to understand this particular phenomenon of Euroscepticism. And in my lecture, what I would like to do is hopefully to reinforce some of the conceptual and methodological concerns that you've got with your project and in your individual part projects, and perhaps also give some generic, at this stage, of course, suggestions for how you can take your individual project and the project as a whole forward. And we can discuss this, of course, in more detail tomorrow morning. As I understand it, I would encourage you to use this 2-hour session that we've got tomorrow morning, not just as a critique of my presentation, which of course is welcome and which I will then use, of course, for revising the paper for publication in the Institut journal. But I'm also very happy, of course, to give feedback on the overall project, but also the individual part projects. And in some cases, I've worked on similar issues and maybe particularly useful for those who are working on those projects to get some feedback, which could connect perhaps to what I'm going to say in the lecture tonight. Now, I've titled the lecture Historicizing Euroscepticism, Varieties of Critical Engagement with the European Union. Klaus Hensch was a German Social Democrat member of the European Parliament for 30 years and its president from 1994 to 1997. In his first years, he repeatedly discussed with Altiero Spinelli, the Italian federalist MEP who was working on the draft treaty on European Union, which the European Parliament eventually passed in 1984, but which was never ratified. Hensch did not fully share Spinelli's highly ambitious federalist agenda. He was keen instead to prioritize EC-level policy initiatives to combat socioeconomic problems like the high unemployment as an alternative way of legitimizing European integration in the eyes of citizens. Hensch has recalled that at one point Spinelli, I quote, looked at me skeptically, is he even for Europe? This little anecdote serves to illustrate two important points to be considered in research on Euroscepticism. Who is for or against Europe, in the words of Hensch describing Spinelli, lies in the eye of the beholder and is historically contingent. Not surprisingly, therefore, political scientists studying the EU have failed to come up with an intellectually coherent, let alone consensual definition of Euroscepticism. Their research has implicitly been informed by normative assumptions about politically acceptable attitudes to European integration. Moreover, in the last 20 years, Euroscepticism has become closely identified with right-wing populism. Legitimate political concerns about rhetorical radicalization and democratic backsliding produce even less clarity about the nature and scope of Euroscepticism as an already ill-defined concept. At the same time, social science research about European integration during the Cold War period was quite narrow in several ways. The behavioral transactionalist and neo-functionalist research was innovative in taking a transnational perspective on what later became known as Europeanization. However, it was also overly enthusiastic about the degree of centralization in Brussels, naive in its assumption about the growth of European identity of political actors and about any transfer of their political allegiance to Brussels, and shallow and uncritical in its use of published statements by the institutions and societal actors for reconstructing integration as process. From the 1970s onwards, political science research focused on the new supranational institutions. It only began to explore similarities, not connections, between the national level of federal states like Germany and the ECEU level from the mid-1980s onwards. In a historical perspective, we should instead conceive of European integration as the conflictual emergence of a transnational polity with an increasing degree of institutionalization, which is a site of contentious politics. In my lecture, I aim to show how imaginations, narratives, and policies of integrating Europe have historically produced counter movements informed by different opposed concepts of its desirable spatial scope, constitutional nature, or socio-economic political character. Treating the present-day EU as a polity in the making allows us to historicize and normalize Euroscepticism as what I call varieties of critical engagement with European Union with a small u. In the first section of my lecture, I will analyze how competing visions of three dimensions of European integration, namely its spatial scope, constitutional nature, and socio-economic political character, produce cleavages that inform varieties of critical engagement with European Union in the past. Understanding their alternative visions, narratives, and preferences helps us clarify why particular social and political groups have shown different degrees of support for or opposition to this or that kind of Europe in changing historical circumstances. Crucially, for example, until the end of the Cold War, Euroscepticism was much more widespread on the radical left than the radical right. In the second section, I will briefly suggest a combination of three approaches to understanding why and how different social and political groups have critically engaged with European Union. The first is to reconstruct individual and collective experiences, real or imagined, of the impact of decision-making in Brussels. The second is to identify and analyze storytellers and their counter-narratives that present such decision-making as remote, incompatible with national culture and tradition, or as inspired by foreign ideas and preferences. And the third is to explore the resulting national as well as transnational political mobilization and contestation. Studying such contestation will demonstrate how pro-Europeans and Eurosceptics have interacted to produce particular institutional and policy outcomes that have shaped the present-day EU. In this way, it is possible to see forms of Eurosceptic activism as an important contribution to European integration and EU politics, both analytically and also normatively. Historicizing Euroscepticism as varieties of critical engagement with European Union always requires, in my view, a transnational perspective, even if the focus of the empirical research is on nationally organized social groups and political parties. Now, the formation of the European coal and steel community in 1951-52 resulted from a set of coalescing political actors with a mix of cultural notions of Europe and constitutional and policy preferences that were easier to implement in an organization with this kind of limited spatial scope, or what later became known and what I'm going to refer to in the lecture as the core Europe of only 6 member states. Among these notions and preferences, 3 stand out that especially provoked Eurosceptic counter-mobilization. The first was especially influential among Christian Democrats. This was the notion of creating a community with roughly the same spatial scope and in the cultural tradition of the medieval Carolingian Empire. Connecting to notions of a Christian Abendland, this core Europe, in this view, was influenced by Catholicism as a religion and a way of life. Its supporters were also positive about the inclusion of Latin Catholic influenced, allegedly Latin Catholic influenced regions of Western Germany, which could be redeemed from National Socialism. Moreover, they of course strongly opposed Soviet communism. Core Europe to many also appeared to form a natural economic space. Its coal and steel industries had been interconnected for a long time. In fact, they had formed cartels since the late 19th century. Despite the disruptive effects of the 2 world wars, the emerging core Europe was thus impregnated with multiple experiences of spatially specific forms of technocratic internationalism. Although many initially agitated against the European Coal and Steel Treaty as a bureaucratic monster, industry leaders in continental Europe nevertheless saw core Europe as a natural space for economic reconstruction and cooperation. Some socialist or socialist-dominated trade unions were similarly supportive of integration with such a limited scope. Additionally, some on the left, especially in France, imagined the emerging core Europe as the core of a larger economic and political space. connecting the Europe of the six with its member states' remaining colonial empires or future post-colonial independent states, especially in Africa, such a union could buttress a European way of life, constitute a progressive third force, and help Western Europe retain influence in the emerging bipolar world. Crucially, these notions and preferences were deliberately or inadvertently exclusionary in drawing the borders of the emerging, more integrated Europe. Thus, the Christian Democrats actively promoted the exclusion of the allegedly Prussian-dominated militaristic Eastern Germany, now under Soviet control. They also coalesced around the objective of marginalizing the United Kingdom, which they believed would only disrupt core Europe. As Georges Bidault put it in a meeting with Konrad Adenauer in June 1949, I quote, "Three kinds of Europe are possible: an English Europe, which means no Europe at all, a Russian Europe, which means Asia. As for Europe for everyone, the basis for this is a Franco-German rapprochement." Moreover, the notion of Eurafrique or Eurafrica sought to create organic links with French and Belgian African colonial possessions, an ambition later achieved in a more limited form through the Yaoundé and Lomé treaties. This to maintain privileged relations with the then former colonies, expressly at the expense of Commonwealth countries and British colonies. The creation of core Europe marked a radical move away from the spatial scope of the OEC and the Council of Europe as lowest common denominator forms of cooperation. As such, this was bound to create dissent both within and outside of the six member states. To begin with, the integration with long-term political objectives of six member states with collective tariff borders and executive powers for the new high authority, which Stalin treated as a mere economic extension of NATO, seemed to many in the SPD, in the German Social Democratic Party, to preclude exploring avenues to German-German cooperation, let alone unification or reunification. The SPD supported European cooperation, but it did not want to give up its hope for the inclusion of a unified German state in any construction following some form of détente between East and West. SPD leader Kurt Schumacher articulated his Euroscepticism regarding Adenauer's priority for Western integration especially aggressively. But many in the SPD and beyond initially shared his concerns. In fact, in his own party, Adenauer had to deal with Eurosceptics like Jakob Kaiser, who similarly wanted to prioritize German unification. Thus, in the early Federal Republic, Euroscepticism directed at core Europe was at least in part motivated by its form of spatial organization, which appeared to divide Germany for good. Close bilateral cooperation between France and Germany without the involvement of the United Kingdom proved to be similarly divisive. After all, continental European socialists were initially strongly oriented towards the British Labour Party. For SPD leaders from cities like Hamburg and Bremen, for example, their Protestant-influenced cultural connections, political networks, and regional trade links were mainly with Britain and Scandinavia, as well as overseas. In France, after 1945, many socialists admired how British parliamentary democracy had survived the fascist onslaught in the interwar period. They initially looked to European leadership by the Labour Party, which in government during 1945 to 51 seemed to be on a non-revolutionary path to socialism. Their initially strong preference for a broader spatial scope for integration to include the United Kingdom was only mitigated when Labour refused to countenance any supranational institutional features in 1950. Still, the skeptical attitudes of many French socialists towards core Europe, which were reinforced by Schumacher's nationalism, lingered, and they contributed to the party's deep split over the issue of the European defense community during 1952-54. Euroscepticism on the moderate political left was even stronger outside of core Europe than inside. This was also based on different geographical imaginations. For many in the Labour Party, only two spaces really mattered: the national British for the implementation of its nationalization and social reform policies, and the Commonwealth and Empire for its ideological internationalism and moderate decolonization agenda. While desirable as such, any cooperation in Europe was not allowed to interfere with its priorities for these two economic and political spaces. As Winston Churchill's three circuits doctrine shows, the socialist spatial vision was broadly aligned with that of the conservatives, who rated the largely imagined, I would say, special relationship with the US higher and had a more traditional understanding of empire and its role for Britain's identity as a world power. Their spatial notions of the United Kingdom's role with, not of Europe, in the words of Churchill in 1930, initially made membership in core Europe organizations look quite impossible for all but a few leading members in both parties. They were not so much actively Eurosceptic, however, as ignorant of the motivations and objectives behind the formation of core Europe. Notions of cooperation in Europe remained clouded in the United Kingdom by the experience of global dominance in and through empire. By the time of the second British application for EEC membership in 1967, George Brown, the pro-European foreign minister, asked his German counterpart Willy Brandt to let the United Kingdom into the EEC, I quote, so that we can take the lead. In addition to the inability of most British politicians to understand the EEC as a highly legally and institutionally integrated community of equals, British Euroscepticism remained influenced by mental maps shared beyond the political elites. On these maps, core Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church as the cultural archenemy since the English and Scottish Reformations, prone to revolutions, radical movements, and regimes and political instability, and potentially or actually dominated by hostile powers, especially France and Germany. Some of these perceptions were also shared elsewhere, like in Scandinavia. Euroscepticism there was in fact initially even more informed by cultural perceptions of otherness than in the United Kingdom. In the Danish and Norwegian 1972 referendums about membership, for example, the no camp still agitated against the alleged influence of the Catholic Church in the EC. Both the left socialists in Norway, as well as the Christian Lutheran political parties in Norway and Sweden, drew on latent anti-Catholicism. The left socialists, as well as the Swedish Social Democrats, also argued that their progressive welfare state values and institutions would be threatened in the EC as a capitalist, conservative, and colonial club. At the same time, Euroscepticism elsewhere in Europe was informed by incompatible national notions of empire. This is especially true of the Salazar regime that drew on the idea of Portugal as an Atlantic empire rather than a European state. Eurosceptic spatial notions of Europe have frequently been linked to different visions of the constitutional nature of integration. Comparing EU institutional practices with those of more traditional international organizations historically shows fewer fundamental differences in practice than in constitutional theory and narrative. Nonetheless, core Europe was already founded with the EEC treaty objective of creating an ever closer union. Ill-defined as the EU's finalité politique may have been, two key points stand out in historical perspective. The first is the EU's character as a highly integrated legal system with defined supranational powers. The second point concerns the activism and influence of a set of legal and political actors, from judges to federalist entrepreneurs like Spinelli and institutions like the European Parliament, who have driven a process of constitutionalization. This process, in turn, has deepened integration over time, both in terms of institutional powers and common policies. The narratives of pro-integration political entrepreneurs and activists for a very long time have made this future appear as if it was lurking just around the corner, potentially threatening national identities or leading to the demise of nation states. In the meantime, moreover, the EU has acquired quasi-federalist characteristics such as its own legal personality and a common currency. The constitutionalization impulse and process has provoked varieties of Eurosceptic counter-movements. The first has evolved at the level of legal concepts and arguments. Legal experts with a background in national law advanced alternative interpretations of EC law, which contested the Court of Justice's heavily supranational vision. In its 1974 So Lange decision, for example, the German Constitutional Court negated the EC's ability to guarantee the rights of its citizens in the absence of provisions comparable to those of the German Basic Law. Much more dramatically, and in a direct challenge to the EU's entire legal order, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal may very soon in September de facto claim that Polish courts have the power to decide if and how to apply EU laws at all. The battle among courts and lawyers over the character of EU law in historical perspective reflects diverging, highly politicized notions of European integration somewhere between federalism and intergovernmentalism. These in turn are anchored in diverging historical and future narratives about the nation and Europe. Inside For Europe, de Gaulle first coherently articulated the nation-state-centric intergovernmental vision in the 1960s. According to him, nation states were the only sources of democratic legitimacy in an intergovernmental setting in which institutions like the European Commission only fulfilled supportive administrative functions. De Gaulle's vision of the EU's constitutional nature was influenced both by a nationalist vision of France's historical heritage, collective identity, and destiny as a global power, and by a republicanism that was closely connected with the nation and nation state since the French Revolution. Similar constitutional preferences also permeated other political groups, however, especially on the political left. In Denmark, for example, the Danish People's Movement Against the EC, formed in the early 1970s, has traditionally advocated Dexit, Denmark's exit from the European Union, considering EU membership as incompatible with the survival of Denmark as an autonomous and sovereign state. Importantly, such constitutional fundamentalism has been quite rare in the history of European integration. For example, conservative British governments that for a long time cultivated the notion of parliamentary sovereignty of the House of Commons nonetheless successfully proposed the use of majority voting for intergovernmental decisions on the correct implementation of the EFTA Convention in the late 1950s and for decisions regarding the EU's internal market in the 1980s. Most Eurosceptics cultivated notions of national sovereignty that could be handled flexibly to gain fiscal advantages or preferred policy solutions. So far, at least, Brexit still marks an exception to this general pattern. In this case, a radically sovereignist view of the nation and the EU prevailed, not just in the 2016 referendum, but to a large extent also in the negotiated outcome, which included the United Kingdom's exit from the internal market. Although those who created Core Europe had greater or lesser political ambitions, they focused on market integration in the first instance. Consequently, Eurosceptic criticism was initially directed mainly at its socio-economic form and its impact on the European economy as a whole and on constituent groups like farmers and workers, for example. Crucially, market integration in the 50s and 60s was not shaped by a cohesive economic ideology articulated by a set of purposeful actors. Rather, it constituted a kind of histoire croisée characterized by a set of compromises between different national political economy traditions, ideological positions, and policy preferences. Compromise continued to shape market integration well into the 1980s and beyond. Thus, the internal market agenda in the 1980s combined liberal policy instruments to abolish non-tariff barriers with re-regulation at the EU level and many exemptions, for example, for the cultural sector. It also initiated low-level social policy integration. As a result, most Eurosceptics effectively directed their criticism at this compromise character. Liberal critics believed that market integration was neo-corporatist and overly bureaucratic in its internal organization and not promoting free trade enough in its external policies, a position that has been quite widespread in parts of the Brexit and Leave campaign, of course. Embedded in the order-liberal political economy tradition, the German economics minister Ludwig Erhard, for example, advocated a strong role for European institutions only in structuring the market to create a level playing field, most importantly through a common competition policy. At the same time, criticism by economic liberals of the compromise character of market integration was also directed at two other aspects that shaped EEC politics in the 1960s. The first concerned its emerging agricultural subsidy system, using up roughly 80% of the EC's own resources when they were created in 1970. The common agricultural policy included an array of heavily market distorting measures. Moreover, negotiating and renegotiating the subsidy system heavily bureaucratized the nature of policymaking in Brussels. Economic liberals inside and outside of the EEC were also critical of what they regarded as its lack of stronger support for freer trade. This concerned its refusal under French influence to opt for an economic accommodation with EFTA in the early 1960s, as well as the preferential effects of the EEC's managed relations with former colonies. Thus, economically liberal Eurosceptics like Erhard or Margaret Thatcher and in export-oriented industrial and service sectors, in fact, saw themselves as better Europeans for criticizing the insufficiently, in their view, liberal character of the EEC. From the non-communist left, criticism of the EEC's market integration remained muted during the Trente Glorieuses until the 1973 oil crisis. Most trade unions were following a policy of conditional support for market integration and freer trade, from which they expected easier access to a greater variety of goods at lower prices and lower living costs for their members. Moreover, full employment across the EEC outside of the Mezzogiorno from the mid-1950s onwards gave the trade unions strong bargaining power, facilitated real wage increases, leading to narrowing income gaps, accompanied by rising welfare provisions, including better pensions and overall rising living standards. Until well into the 1970s, therefore, the perceived positive effects of market integration were a significant factor in the growing permissive consensus about the desirability of further integration. Eurosceptic socialist-inspired criticism of EEC market integration was initially stronger outside of the EEC than inside. The Labour left feared that following the United Kingdom's accession, greater competition from more productive industries on the continent would endanger their vision of a national welfare state and the, in some sectors, exceptionally strong union influence at the shop floor level. Many Swedish social democrats and trade unionists warned that EEC membership would similarly call into question their national welfare state model of the Volkshemmet, or the caring state, as it had developed in the post-war period. Eurosceptic criticism on the political left of the EEC as market integration only really increased with the growing structural economic crisis from the 1970s onwards. Still, trade unions predominantly saw the EEC as a safe haven for defending a European social model in terms of growing global economic competition. At that time, right-wing parties like the Italian neo-fascists and the French Front National, in fact, supported further market integration in the EEC as a means for liberalizing national economies and for curtailing left-wing, as they saw it, political and trade union influence domestically. In the 1970s, Euroscepticism also expanded beyond the socio-economic form and impact of integration, reflecting the different and broader agendas of the new social movements and in some member states growing regional identities and demands for decentralization. Thus, the German Green Party argued in favor of a Europe of independent eco-regions in the 1980s, which was equally critical of the nation state and the European communities. However, forms of Euroscepticism anchored in regionalist imagined geographies over time transformed into pro-integration positions, thus culminating in German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer's lecture at the Humboldt University in Berlin in May 2000. The German Greens began to favor the European Union as a federal model of multi-level governance that protects regions. Now, in addition to studying the three main cleavages over its spatial scope, constitutional nature, and socio-economic political character, I recommend a combination of three complementary conceptual approaches to understanding better in historical perspective why and how different social and political groups have critically engaged with the European Union. The first of these approaches is to reconstruct individual and collective experiences, real or imagined, of the local and national impact of decision-making in Brussels and the legislation of the European Union. In other words, a kind of subaltern or Alltagsgeschichte of integration from below, which avoids the pitfalls of the heavily structuralist social history of European integration, most obviously, I think, embodied in the works of Hartmut Keltler, that over-relies on statistics, excludes individual experiences, and tells a neat, optimistic story about integration as an apparently relentless process of Europeanization. Such historical research would take individual people and social groups seriously with their experiences and agency. This in turn could help explain why varieties of critical engagement with the European Union may have resonated and become influential in different spatial contexts and time periods. So far, most historical as well as sociological research on European integration, including my own, has focused on political elites and their networks. By drawing on autobiographical records and oral history, we may find, however, that citizens perceive the impact of European integration in very different and, if perhaps, diffuse ways. We know next to nothing about their experiences with the impact of European integration on their lives and how they may have fed into varieties of critical engagement with what could perhaps be called, slightly provocatively, the real existing European Union in an analogy with the notion of the real existing socialism, as opposed to the hardly contested general idea of European cooperation as such. Eurosceptics make sense of any negative experiences with or perceptions of the real existing EU through storytelling that systematizes them in narratives that criticize or seek to discredit the institutions in Brussels, pro-integration elites or particular policies and their impact. Narratives as meaning-making tools have recently been explored in interdisciplinary research on the EU. Some of this research has specifically explored narrative representations of the past in the present, which are designed to legitimize European integration and the EU. I think in one of your project descriptions, the House of European History is mentioned as an example that I've worked on myself and which is certainly an interesting case or example of this. However, it has not tackled the role of narrators and narratives in the past, the period that you are looking at in your historical project, let alone systematically explored those who have told stories critical of European integration. A possible second conceptual tool for research on Euroscepticism in the history of European integration. Some authors have represented Eurosceptic narratives as uncrystallized, allegedly lacking their own explicit project. However, resurrecting the lost past of an apparently unconstrained nation with global influence has turned out to be a sufficiently powerful narrative to extricate the United Kingdom from the European Union. Britain has in fact had a grand narrative tradition since the Congress of Vienna about itself as an eternal external outsider in Europe, which allowed Leave supporters to set out Brexit as a return to the country's glorious natural position and destiny. Moreover, the pro-integration narrative has always been very weakly articulated in the United Kingdom, with EU membership appearing as a measure of last resort to secure limited economic benefits, which created a narrative void that the Leave campaign was able to fill. There are other examples of powerful Eurosceptic narratives, however, which clearly draw on sentiments that may only have been buried temporarily or overshadowed by shallow pro-integration narratives like the return to Europe and East Central Europe. And I would encourage you to look for these hidden or buried sentiments or narratives in some of your projects where this is relevant, which maybe only became relevant again in the post-World War period. In Poland, for example, the Law and Justice Party and government has succeeded in transforming the pro-integration narrative of the country as an aspiring saint into a disillusioned rebel counter-narrative. This has redefined illiberal values as a Polish national normal under attack from the EU's alien Western values. Drawing on self-images of Poland as the savior of Christian Europe, Jarosław Kaczyński is impersonating Jan Sobieski. Only this time, the de facto Polish leader is battling with the LGBT movement as the advance guard of an atheist Western Europe. As the case of Italy shows, however, pro-integration narratives may only have been very weakly embedded even in some founding member states. There, technocratic and political elites for a long time narrated European integration as an essential external constraint, as Daniele Paspinucci has put it. In this narrative, being governed from Brussels rather than Rome was the only guarantee of domestic fiscal prudence and economic reforms. More recently, Eurosceptics have turned the shallow, self-denigrating pro-integration narrative on its head, transforming Brussels into an unwelcome outsider, allegedly dictating to an oppressed Italy. These examples show the relative weakness of some pro-integration narratives in concrete national or temporal contexts. These weaknesses are well worth exploring, in my view, to identify and analyze counter-narratives that have their roots in post-war Europe or before, even if in some cases they have only achieved a political breakthrough more recently. For example, Eurosceptics in Britain and Scandinavia sought to counter the EC's increasingly hegemonic ambitions for the organization of Western Europe with their own spatial alternatives outside the present-day EU. Thus, in the European Free Trade Association, formed in 1959-60, the EFTA, formed in 1959-60, constituted an institutional platform for projecting alternative notions of Europe. Some British and Swiss narrators, for example, emphasized its contribution to a free trade Europe as opposed to the allegedly more protectionist EC, something that the Leave campaign drew on much later with its notion of global Britain unchained. This takes me to my third and last point. Historical research on Euroscepticism should not limit itself to exploring varieties of critical engagement with the European Union as, if you like, the mere association of experiences and narratives. Rather, it should analyze how such experiences, perceptions, and storytelling fed into and were used for purposes of political mobilization, and how this impacted on politics and policymaking. At the same time, research on the history of Euroscepticism should adopt a broad understanding of actors, assume a transnational, not merely national lens, and develop a keen interest in processes of socialization and transfer in Eurosceptic circuits and organizations. Much of the incipient research on political Euroscepticism focuses on political parties, parliaments, and electoral campaigns. This focus seems to rest on the assumption that traditional political actors dominated the post-war parliamentary systems until the emergence of the new social movements from the 1960s onwards. Even for the first 20 years after 1945, however, research on Euroscepticism should also explore less institutionalized intellectual circles or organizations as carriers of critical attitudes to real existing European integration, which had different primary political objectives than criticizing Europe. So in your project, I would advise you not just to look for references to Europe. You may find Euroscepticism in other areas and discourses that are not specifically directed at or about Europe. Research on Euroscepticism should also explore the role of new social movements. The issues they addressed and their ideological agendas were international in scope, and their activism was at least partly transnational in character. These new social movements' original agendas did not primarily target the EC, but often implied criticism of the real existing European Union, such as market integration, aggravating environmental degradation. These movements' often only implicit Eurosceptic agendas help explain why the EC as such was actually more ideologically contested in the 1970s than in the 2000s, despite the still growing permissive consensus on the general desirability of further integration. Crucially, studying these social movements through a transnational lens also shows how what political scientists call political opportunity structures have at times changed fast and resulted in the inversion of Eurosceptic narratives and activism. Thus, many left-wing environmental activists during the 1970s began to see the EC as a more suitable platform than the nation state for addressing transnational issues like air and water pollution and acid rain. They even colluded with conservative pro-integration conservationists to advance their agenda. Thus, by drawing attention to an obviously transnational issue like environmental degradation, Euroscepticism, in inverted commas, in fact, facilitated greater transnational regulation and the EU's acquisition of formal powers in this field in the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty. The example of the environmental movement also points to the need to pay attention to processes of socialization and transfer in Euroscepticism broadly defined. Thus, when EC institutions and pro-integration political actors took up demands from societal actors or radical political parties for new or different forms of collective political action, they often succeeded in mitigating criticism. Their active strategies for including non-traditional and often initially more critical actors progressively through formal and informal consultation mechanisms appears to have contributed to the taming of their Eurosceptic ideological positions, preferences, and narratives. Now, in my lecture, I have hopefully demonstrated why research on Euroscepticism should treat the history of European integration as the conflictual emergence of a transnational polity and site of contentious politics. Such an approach, in my view, allows us to understand how imaginations, narratives, and policies of integrating Europe have historically produced counter movements informed by different and opposed concepts of its desirable spatial scope, constitutional nature, or socio-economic political character. Treating the EU as a transnational polity in the making allows us to historicize and normalize Euroscepticism as varieties of critical engagement with European Union. In this regard, comparisons with the conflictual formation of modern nation states in the long 19th century could be instructive to highlight the futility of drawing on a normatively loaded concept like Euroscepticism for analyzing the history of European integration. Thus, few in the 1848 German Paulskirche Parliament claimed that the advocates of a spatially larger Großdeutsch solution for German unification were Germano-skeptic, let alone anti-German. Similarly, in drawing up the US Constitution as a compromise text in 1787, neither the so-called patriots nor the nationalists called each other anti-American for supporting different institutional blueprints. Equally, few in late 19th century Britain insinuated that those now advocating new protectionist tariffs were anti-British for demanding a fundamental change to the homemade global policy design of free trade. Moreover, the present-day EU, although it has emerged as an organization of mostly already well-integrated states, has clearly acquired many federal features. This also invites a long-term historical comparison with the formation of federal entities. Switzerland and the US, for example, experienced severe domestic conflicts in the middle of the 19th century over their constitutional nature and policies like slavery, which even led to the civil wars of 1847-48 in the case of Switzerland and 1861-65 in the case of the US. Thus, studying Euroscepticism in historical perspective also invites us to explore how the present-day European Union has so far avoided a similar violent implosion through its sophisticated institutional system and consensus-oriented practices, as well as the possibility since the Lisbon Treaty of peaceful secession as a measure of last resort. Considering experiences, narratives, and political mobilization through a transnational lens, moreover, will lead us to recognize that and better understand how varieties of critical engagement with European Union have interacted with each other and with pro-integration actors and their political ideas, narrative, activism, and decision-making. And this is something that we've argued in the introduction to this forthcoming special issue, that's Richard McMahon, my colleague from the UCL, and myself. Just as in the Japanese martial art of Jiu-Jitsu, Eurosceptic ideas and narratives have returned against the EU the force of pro-integration narratives on peace, democracy, and welfare gains, leading to accommodation and compromises. In this sense, the present-day EU has not been made by pro-integration elites only, but also by Eurosceptics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Wolfram Kaiser. You have presented a proposal to study European integration history and the European community and European Union as the emergence of a political entity. It caused much conflict. As a transnational polity in the making. You've stressed three main cleavages around that, that a transnational entity in the making, spatial scope, legal questions, economics, and social questions, and suggested three approaches to study these questions. I think we have quite a lot to talk about, and we will have a brief moment to do that now for another 25 minutes or so. So if there's questions either from you or from the invisible audience on Zoom, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really a great talk, and I really mean it. It was fascinating, and I think you touched so many important questions and gave really good answers. So I just can thank you. I was intrigued by one remark. I don't have any criticism till so far, but I was intrigued by one remark when you suggested a kind of a history from below of the experience of the EU. And my question is, since I do not have many ideas with respect to that, how can you do it? Because when I remember my own youth, when, well, I'm the oldest one in this room, I don't know, but the EU never, ever played a role in my life, I would say. If I would write a kind of biography, the NATO would probably play a role. But since I'm not in agriculture, I never was in agriculture, I never had many ideas what the EU actually was, although I was engaged at least a little bit on the political left. So could you give us some ideas how you could study this kind of history of below?
I absolutely don't have a perfect answer for this, of course. It's just a conceptual suggestion at the moment, because I'm frustrated with my own work up to a point, and with a lot of the work that's now emerging in Euroscepticism, which treats this as the result of some elite discourse or narrative that's produced for different political reasons or purposes, as in the case of Boris Johnson, for example, just to become prime minister. But it could have other serious, more serious, if you like, reasons. But the focus is always on political elites that are to some extent transnationally connected and trying to shape the European Union in some form or another. And I think that's a very important perspective. I've tried to look into this and to reconstruct this myself in some of my work. But what I find frustrating about this is, when you are interested in Euroscepticism, is that it also just treats those who, 52% of British people, for example, who voted for Brexit, or others who support Eurosceptic or Europopulist political parties, as mere Stimmvieh, or as manipulated masses that are not don't have sufficient knowledge or are not competent enough to understand what the benefits of the European Union and different European policies are. And in fact, that's not just, I think, a perspective, an academic perspective, but it's also to some extent a political perspective that is quite dangerous. But that's a normative side remark. Now, my suggestion is to think about Europe as something that is not necessarily experienced in the sense that everyone would have understood that a particular impact, as in the case of the farming community, for example, on their lives, on their everyday lives, was generated by Brussels, in inverted commas, or Brussels policy making, but that could at least be imagined as being influenced by coming from Brussels. And I think the imagination of this is perhaps more important. Experiencing this as imagined impact, if you like, is more important. And this could be positive or negative impact. For example, if you are a South Italian migrant workers, you may think in the late 1960s, migration obviously started earlier on the basis basis of bilateral agreements, but that the free movement of people in the European communities could bring lots of benefits for people who are unemployed and now can seek work in Luxembourg or in the Netherlands or in Germany and make fiscal transfers to their relatives in Italy. So this would be, for example, an obvious case where I think these migrants would have understood that they are also in a different position from, say, Turkish labor that came to Germany and where you already have this Anwerbungsstoff, I think in 1973 or whenever, because as an Italian, for example, you could continue to come to Germany within the European communities after that day. So it could be this actual experience, which can be positive and can be negative, but it could also just be the feeling that there's some remote, as in the context of the United States, remote power in Washington, some imagined new center that is changing my life. And this change in the life conditions, the point is it doesn't have to come from Brussels. It may not be influenced by Brussels, but it can be imagined as coming from Brussels. And I think we need to find a way of getting at that, also in historical perspective. And I don't have answers to this. I'm going to supervise a PhD student, and I think those who are working on British Euroscepticism may be interested in linking up with that person, perhaps. Or at least I would be interested in such a link. This PhD student will look at a locality, and I think that's what we have to do in this context, Birmingham in this case, and compare the referendum campaigns of 1972 and 1975, sorry, about continued membership of Britain in the European communities, and 2016. And he has to devise such a methodology and think about ways in which he can look at locally produced documents in the context of the campaigns, which are not direct, don't come directly from London, maybe show some degree of divergence in terms of how membership, in terms of its impact, is perceived and advocated or negated. And he can look at, and he can try to use oral history interviews in order to try and get at that, for example, indirectly, not by asking, do you remember were you for or did you vote for or against, but by trying to find out more about the actual social conditions and living conditions in localities at that point in time, and how that might have related to these bigger questions about should the UK, in this case, be or remain a member of the European communities. So I don't really have an answer to this, but I think it's really important that research on Euroscepticism gets at this to avoid falling into this trap that we can explain everything by looking at what, in this case, the Eurosceptic and partly transnationally connected elites have argued and why they've argued this, because the rest is explained by the idea that the masses are manipulated by the elites. And sorry, if I can just add one thing, and again, I think because I don't have enough grounding in anthropology or psychology, which could be useful for this, intercultural contact, that's also, I think, an important aspect, can have both, from this integration perspective, positive or negative impact. So it may well be that if you do not speak several languages and your cultural contact is limited to, for example, to remain with this British context, which I know quite well, and your only intercultural contact is through your own language, and you don't actually have access to other cultures which you visit during your holidays or other cultures of migrant workers, etc., then maybe this kind of confrontation, which could have been induced by some generic processes of globalization, but also perhaps framed to some extent by policies of the European Union in terms of worker migration by EU citizens into the United Kingdom, for example. And there are now probably 5 million EU citizens. The government didn't, of course, know this until there were maybe 3 million citizens. And that this might also have an impact, potentially a negative impact on perceptions of the European Union on the everyday life of citizens. And this, I think, being sensitive to the cultural setting and context and not assuming a priori, which is probably what we tend to assume as academics, that transnational and intercultural context is per se a good thing and will lead to better understanding and from the EU's perspective to greater support for the European Union as an institutional setting, perhaps. But this is something that's perhaps misplaced, and we need to find a way of getting at that too.
Martin Baumeister.
In the first moment, I would have agreed with Wolfram Löwe's observation concerning our own dimension or our own experiences with with European integration as a starting point to consider the dimension of European, we could call that by quoting Koselleck's space of experience. But I remember only as a starting point giving the example of southern Italy at the climax of anti-European mobilization in Italy, a commentary on La Repubblica, I think by Spinelli's daughter Barbara Spinelli, quoting the example of a southern Italian village, referring to the concrete experiences of the population with Europe, which has been and is rather positive in many aspects, not only, but I think there are many, and as far as I'm regarding all the problems of Schengen, border problematic, the introduction of the euro, there are many aspects which have changed our personal experiences and mobility in Europe and so on. I think that would be a very valuable approach, considering different groups and settings, academia, agriculture, village and the city, and so on. The most famous example probably is rather banal Erasmus generation. And I think that would be an important dimension we have been missing up to the history of European integration.
So there's of course some sociological work on this, but only focusing on the positive sides, if you like, and there's work on Erasmus student exchanges and so on, but that's very contemporary. Of course, here you're more interested in the historical perspective on this. And I think some of these experiences, as you've mentioned already, go back to before the end of the Cold War, such as free movement of people or the incipient regional policy, which came along with the big signs, which you can see everywhere in southern Italy, on Ireland, etc. This was part funded with the European, or in Eastern Europe, European Union funding under its regional policy, etc. So it's partly the actual impact, but partly experience of actual impact, but it can be just the experience of perceived impact. And I don't think it matters whether that's actual impact or not. What matters is how people have experienced it from their own personal perspective. So I understand that there are methodological problems, but there are also at least conceptual ways of looking at this. And there isn't any research that I know of. Yeah, that's the challenge, that has done this or that you could build on. But at the very least, it might be a good idea to think about this in a, you know, at a kind of meso level, or however you want to phrase that. So if, for example, you are now working on trade unions in Italy, as one of the projects is going to do, Italy and France and Spain, for example, it might be an idea for each of these three countries to go down to the local level and check archives whether there's any trace of discussions of European matters at this local level, and whether it differs in any way from the way in which the discourse is developed by the national trade union elites, because there may be you may find potentially that there's the peponess, if you like, the peponess of this trade union world. It wasn't trade unions, I think just the communist mayor of a Tuscan town, but they could feature in such a research project by way of extending an existing focus on the national level of politics and policy making of trade unions relatively easily, without completely inversing the project design and starting bottom up, if you like.
So if there's no other immediate question, I put myself on the list. I was very much intrigued by your plea to combine the second and the third approach you mentioned. The narrative representation and counter narratives, but not just to, you know, consider that they exist, but also study when they are used to mobilize support against European integration. So I was wondering if it might be a good idea to know more about possibilities to conceptualize the conditions that make entrepreneurs of counter-narratives successful. The first idea that popped out in my mind was the work, especially in social science literature, on opportunity structures, in the sense of benefits versus costs or threats of opposing European integration. That might be situations right before joining the European community, or a situation right after European community, or a change of government. Well, just in general, I was thinking, does that sound like a possible avenue to deepen the study of conditions that make counter-narratives successful?
Yes, but yes, I think that's all I can say on this for the moment, because I don't have such a conceptualization that I can pull out of the drawer, if you like, for you. But I think it is worth thinking about this in a more structured social science way, in order to also perhaps connect the different projects that you've got and avoid a situation where each historical project is just time and spatially specific and therefore can't relate to any other project. So I think it would be useful to use this kind of thinking to structure the different projects within your overall project. And yes, for example, one key condition is, I think, that it's always easier if you're in political opposition to develop such narratives and use them against those in power, and becomes much more difficult if you're Salvini, for example, and you're suddenly in government and you have to deal with the European Union institutions and the constraints of on policy making, of membership in the European Union, or to justify the actual exit, say, of Italy, for example, from the European Union, for which there may not actually be popular majority support. So this would be one possible criterion, for example, that you could insert into such a conceptualization. But yes, I agree, I think it would be useful to develop that. And from my knowledge of political science literature, it doesn't really exist. And there's very little political science literature that's now emerging, of course, that looks into the question of narratives and how they are produced and how they are used, both within the European Union, also from the outside by actors like Putin in Russia, for example. So this is part of this special issue that we've put together. And I think there's some interesting ideas that might well be relevant to some of your projects in this field. And what I would generally, but that's perhaps at a very basic level, advise is that whether you call it discourse or you call it narrative, and the different ways of conceptualizing and understanding this, is that you don't leave it at reconstructing discourse, because I think that is you get into the danger of using a non-political or apolitical way of discussing this, because you don't understand how these are formed, how these are used in politics or in social relations, and what kind of impact they can generate. And I think that's really important. It's important to come back also to those who create these kinds of narratives and to try and understand what their intentions are, and to see whether success in this sense, in relation to their intentions, they are successful, whether they are successful or not, and why.
Christina von Wolfram.
I really enjoyed your lecture very much. And I think there's quite a few refreshing ideas in there. And I also like the idea of the history from below. And maybe we could discuss tomorrow some more ideas about how you could do it methodologically. Now I would like to ask you about the new social movement that you mentioned, because I think that's another really interesting idea. And it seemed to me that you have the environmentalists in mind when you were talking about that. And it makes sense for them. And it particularly also would make sense for regional movements, like the Basque movement maybe. But what about feminism and the gay movement, which was very important back then? Thinking of that, I didn't see any connection with, say, European pro or counter narratives. Or did you have ideas about that?
No, but in the written version of this, which I've sort of developed already, which will be longer, of course, because I'll have more space, I'm mentioning other movements as well, because I think it's possible to trace this for others as well. I think in one of the project descriptions, the project is on Barbara Castle, for example. She became quite active as an advocate of women's rights in the European Parliament. I think that's an interesting case where a generic concern, if you like, with equality questions, as it was conceptualized in those days, was then taken into the European Parliament or developed in the context of the European Parliament because it was seen as perhaps a more fruitful site, political and institutional site, for developing the advocacy for women's rights. So with the women's rights movement, as it would have been conceptualized in the 1970s, I think what is interesting is that as opposed to the environmental movement, it wasn't altogether obvious that the European communities as they existed at the time would provide a suitable institutional and legal framework for fostering women's rights. But what did happen with these movements as they were developing from the local level upwards mostly and developing transnational connections was that they looked at the European economic community and found that it was just as male dominated and not caring much about the opportunities for women, etc., as probably most other national contexts, perhaps somewhat less than some other national contexts, actually rather than more, but that the European communities did have one point in its original treaty, which was about equal pay for men and women. This is already in the EEC treaty, and I think that was taken up in the 1970s. I believe that there's some incipient research about this now, and starting from this point, that obviously this didn't exist, equal pay only on paper, but not in practice, that this was a way of then using the EEC framework in order to propagate at least this as one singular objective of the women's movement in the 1970s, but then developing from that a broader understanding of how such rights should become enshrined legally in the European, what is now the European Union. So the European Commission, interestingly, this is not confined to the environmental movement or the women's movement, but this is a general approach of the European Commission in historical perspective, has often seen such initially marginal forms of advocacy at the local, regional, or national level, and then use this as an opportunity to also present the Europe, its own institutional role, as well as what is now the European Union as a whole, as a suitable site for advancing the rights of, for example, groups like women or minorities, etc. And specifically, and I think it's important that this has created opportunities for cooperation with European institutions, specifically to be able to show that the European integration process, in inverted commas, is about more than market integration. Because that's another, I think, important aspect in the context of the new social movement, is that they are pushing for a different idea of what matters in society. It's not just about growing growth and wealth. And this is something that the EEC maybe is fostering through market integration, but it's actually critical of growth. Okay, this is the late 60s, early 1970s. New social movements are also critical of this simplistic understanding of the benefits of growth, and they advocate different societal objectives. So institutions like the European Commission are to some extent taking this up in order to demonstrate that they have a purpose that goes beyond market integration. And this is where I think you have this cooperation starting, which is it's just been better research for the environment. Jan-Henrik Myers, a German colleague who's now working at the Max Planck Institute for the whatever it's called, Legal Institute in Frankfurt, has worked on this, and he's found interesting alliances also at the level of individuals between people like Petra Kelly, who's one of the co-founders of the German Green Party, used to work in the European Commission as a bureaucrat, and the Social Democratic Commissioner Mansholt from the Netherlands, and someone like Detlef Jahn, the CDU member of the European Parliament, who then resigned in 1979 because it turned out that he'd been a member of the SS. It's a really strange alliances, politically speaking, but for this environmental agenda, to take it out of the regional and national context where legislation to some extent existed and into the European. And that's just much better research. But I believe that there's now work on women's rights and these women's movements in the 70s in a similar vein.
So thank you very much. I think we will have ample time to continue our discussion with Wolfram Kaiser tomorrow morning. As you might have noticed, he has read all of our papers very carefully. And that gives us the opportunity to relate the talk and our individual projects also within the discussion of tomorrow morning. For tonight, thank you very much one more time. This has been truly great. We can now close the day with dinner. Thank you for the discussions we've had, and that is prospects for tomorrow.
Thank you.